let me take you into Physics Class 101. There is something called the second law of thermodynamics. Second law of thermodynamics states this, that the disorder of an isolated system can only increase over time, never decrease. What does that mean? Well, it means that naturally things go from order to disorder. Order to disorder. That's what makes it difficult to maintain systems. That's what makes it difficult to maintain relationships. That's what makes it difficult to maintain machinery. Think about all the stuff in your life that you are required to maintain so that the things in your life keep working. Remember, everything goes from order to disorder naturally. Your car, your AC, your heating unit, your roof, your plumbing. These are some of the machines that demand maintenance. But what about us? We need to maintain our health. We need to maintain our attitudes, our relationships. And without our intentional attention, everything will dilapidate. Everything will go from order to disorder. It's really hard to maintain our resolve to continue to see the results that we want to see. Consider last year, 45 million Americans started a diet. Now, I'm not going to have a show of hands to see who started a diet. Get this, though, estimates vary, but a commonly cited statistic is that 95% of diets fail. Failure is measured by the inability to maintain weight loss long term. Somebody will lose 10 pounds, they'll gain 15. And this is a result of Americans spending some $33 billion every year on diet-related products and services. You know, it causes us to consider, if we Americans can't maintain our diets, how can we as Christians maintain our fervor and our passion for God? You know, strangely, statistics indicate that probably 1 out of 3 of us will grow weary of church and not be here in 5 years from now. To keep doing what you know you need to do demands discipline. It demands persistence. It demands some intense resolve. It demands relentless character development. Now, what is it that causes us to be derailed from what we originally so committed to? There's a story from 2 Samuel chapter 11 about King David, the second king of Israel's history, arguably the greatest king in Israel's history. David himself was a decorated warrior. His conquests were legendary. There's a phrase in 2 Samuel chapter 11. It says, "In the times when kings go out to battle, David stayed home." It later in the context says he got out of bed late in the afternoon. Now, I don't know about you, but if I got up late in the afternoon, I'm probably not where I'm supposed to be. David wasn't where he was supposed to be. He got bored. And in 2 Samuel chapter 11, with no accountability, David goes peeping Tom on his rooftop. One thing leads to another. A pregnancy out of wedlock, a premeditated murder, a cover-up of his affair. In a very short time, David went from maintaining a life, a kingdom, a mission, to squandering it all because he allowed boredom to kind of set in. This morning, we're going to continue to study the book of Revelation. We're going to be observing 2 of the 7 churches that Jesus instructs in Asia, which is modern-day Turkey. In chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation, Jesus verbally addresses 7 churches. The Apostle John is faithful to record Jesus' words as he is in exile on the island of Patmos off the coast of modern-day Turkey. The words of Jesus are for each church he's addressing have this pattern to them. We'll show it in a second. But his words are also principles not only for those churches at the time that he gave the message to those churches, the message is for all generations. Two churches that we're going to look at this morning and we're going to observe are the churches of Sardis and Philadelphia. There were two of the 7 churches. We got the map of this little area, and it was modern-day Turkey. It was labeled as Asia at this time. And we're going to look at Sardis, but we're also going to look at this city called Philadelphia. 7 churches at this time that Jesus addresses at the time that he's giving John the orders of recording. Our discussion is going to start with Sardis. And we're going to look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Now remember, each church that Jesus addresses, there's a pattern of communication that Jesus follows. Who the letter is for, what's the characteristic of Jesus in his glorified state that he wants the church to, that he believes the church most needs. And then what was it that Jesus was commending each church for? What were they doing well? What was their application? And then also, what were they not doing well that he's willing to bring to their attention? So let's start in chapter 3, verse 1. Let's start with, well, who is the church that he's addressing? And then the characteristic that Jesus highlights that he thinks this church most needs from him. So we pick it up in chapter 3, verse 1. It says, to the angel, in other words, there, to the messenger of the church at Sardis, write, he who has 7 spirits of God and 7 stars says this, I know your deeds, and that you have a name, that you are alive, but you're dead. So what do we know about Sardis, this little town? Sardis means those escaping. Well, what are they escaping? Seems as though those in Sardis were escaping nothing. They were certainly, escaping any form of discipline. Because Sardis was known for being a soft people. They were known for being pleasure seekers. They're known for seeking the easy life. Now, of course, there's a temple. There's always a temple involved in a town that isn't doing what they're supposed to do. And the temple that was in Sardis was called the Temple of Cybele, a temple for worshiping the sex goddess Cybele. Now, what else do we know about Sardis? Well, Greek historian Herodotus tells the story of the fall of Sardis. It's a true story. King Cyrus of Persia was the one who conquered the city of Sardis. Now, King Cyrus of Persia observed the city of Sardis sat on the top of a hill. It was on the top of a steep cliff. To reach the top by an invading army seemed impossible. And so there was a certain Persian soldier. He studied the terrain. He just studied Sardis sitting on the top of this peak. By all appearances, it seemed as though there's no way to get to the top, but he just kept watching and observing. He noticed there was a soldier who was on top who accidentally dropped his helmet. His helmet fell off the top of Sardis and tumbled down the side of this steep cliff. So the Persian soldier continued to observe, and what he noticed was this Sardis soldier climbed down to retrieve his helmet, because you see there was this kind of this secret path that he was able to go down and up. And so he goes down this secret path to get his helmet, and then he went up the secret path. Well, that was the passageway. So the Persian soldier then took a group of Persian soldiers and they journeyed to the top. And once they got to the top, what they found were there were no soldiers on duty to defend the city. That was Sardis. They thought more highly of themselves than they should have. You might say at the time when soldiers in Sardis should have been on duty, they stayed home. Now, how does Jesus describe himself in this verse 1? Well, it says the one who has 7 spirits. Let me remind you, 7 is the complete number. And so it's as if Jesus is saying the one who lacks nothing says this. What's interesting about chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Revelation is Jesus is speaking himself. Nobody else is speaking. This isn't somebody else's commentary. This is Jesus himself breathing into the situation. He says, you have a name, Sardis, that's alive. But you know what? You're dead. Remember, Sardis means those escaping, but in reality, they were escaping nothing. And Jesus is saying, your name is alive, but you're spiritually dead. On the surface, they said the right thing, but on their insides, there's deadness. Now, what's interesting is Jesus had nothing good to say about this church in Sardis. Look at verses 2 and 3. Jesus' words to the church at Sardis, wake up, strengthen the things that remain, which were about to die. For I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God. Verse 3, so remember what you have received and heard, and keep it, and repent, change. Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. Jesus is saying, I find no deeds that are worth noting. Several commentators agree Sardis is a church that had the right beliefs on paper, but there was no internal buy-in on the part of the people inside. They were alive on the outside, but they were dead on the inside. You ever hear that phrase? Oh, that's a dead church. They look alive on the outside, but on the inside, there's no Spirit of God. Now, here's an interesting question. How can you tell if a body, if a church that call themselves believers are in fact believers? Well, I think verse 3 gives us an indicator. An alive church is expecting that Jesus will return. A dead church is unaware that Jesus even made the promise. You know, for an alive church, we need to expect that Jesus is coming back. This ought to be in our DNA. We ought to talk about it. We ought to anticipate it. We ought to look forward to it. In the same way we look forward to his first advent, which was Christmas, we ought to look forward to his second advent. That's a good litmus test for whether a church is alive or not. Now look at verse 4. But, he's saying to this church at Sardis, there's a few people among you in Sardis who've not soiled their garments. In other words, your sin hasn't bled through you. And they will walk with me in white. White was always a sign of salvation. For they are worthy. Now, what's interesting, another translation of the Bible says where it says there were a few people. So one translation says there were a few people. There were even in Sardis there were a few people. Now, what an interesting clause. Even in Sardis, it was difficult to be a believer, but even in Sardis, you find a remnant of believers. We find that there's a few Jesus lovers. They haven't compromised their faith. They walk with Jesus in the truth of their salvation. They're men and women whom the world is not worthy, but they are worthy of Jesus' unfailing presence. They haven't quit. Believers don't give up. They live out of the principle that Paul wrote to his disciple Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:2. They're ready in season and they're ready out of season. There's no time off for the faithful. They don't quit. They don't stop. They keep going. Now, Jesus then reveals the reward for the remnant that's faithful. It says in verse 5 and 6, he says, he who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments. I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Then he says what he always says. He says, those who have ear to hear, let them hear, and let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now, Jesus, what he's doing, even though there's just a few believers in Sardis, Jesus assures the faithful, first of all, you're going to be clothed in white. Well, okay. Well, what's the significance of that? When you're in eternity, everyone will admire your faithfulness by your wardrobe. The second thing he says, your name is in the book of life. Now, this is a painful thought, but some of the people we think are in heaven will not be there. Some of the people we don't think will be there will be there. The book of life doesn't lie. There's no middle ground. Either you're in or you're out. You can't fool the book of life. Either you've made the commitment genuinely to place your faith in Christ, or you haven't. There's no middle ground. Let me take you back to my football days. When I played high school football, there were times we didn't play on this stuff called artificial turf. We played in natural grass, and by the time late October and November came around, it was muddy because the grass wasn't real quality grass. Now, when you would play, there was a saying, because you played on Friday night, but on Saturday, what you would do is you would go in to the film room with the coaches and you would watch game film. And the saying about game film is film doesn't lie. Right? Film don't lie. And so what would happen is the films, when you watch the films, you would see your missed blocks. You would see your missed tackles. I know it's hard for you to believe. You're going to have to take this by faith, but I missed a lot of blocks and I missed a lot of tackles. I know that's a shocker. But I had it down. I knew on a muddy field when I missed a block or I missed a tackle, what you do is you roll around on the ground to get mud on the back of your jersey so that people can't read your jersey number. So that when films came around, and so I'd miss a block, and then oh gosh, I'm gonna get so chewed out during film session. Because you're exposed. Films don't lie. And so I would roll around on the ground. This is true, I promise you. And so the next morning, the coaches, who is that? Who missed their block? I can't see his number. And I'm thinking, yes, it worked. But the idea in heaven, you can't fool the system. You can't muddy up your numbers so that no one can see, because the book of life doesn't lie. When it comes to heaven, there's no covering up the deception. Then he says this, for the faithful, Jesus speaks to the Father on our behalf. Now, we've talked about this in past passages, but it's this beautiful picture where it's like you're on trial and Jesus is your defense attorney. And the file of your complete rap sheet, when you open up the file with your complete rap sheet, has totally been emptied. It's been erased by your defense attorney. So he's saying your name's going to be in the book of life, and you know what? Jesus will speak to the Father on your behalf. Well, it's an interesting thing that when we begin to observe the next church we're going to look at, Philadelphia, in Sardis, Jesus had nothing good to say. But with Philadelphia, Jesus has nothing bad to say. So now he's going to shift churches. In verse 7, he's going to talk about this church in Philadelphia, which is one of those 7 churches. This is not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. This is Philadelphia some 2,000 years ago which is now modern-day Turkey, in what they called Asia. So he said, and the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens that no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens, says this. Now, the city is appropriately named Philadelphia. It's the name of brotherly love. And it's appropriate that this city, they loved one another. Now, what's interesting here is Jesus identifies himself by referencing that Jesus is the one who opens, and what Jesus opens, no one can shut. And what Jesus shuts, no one can open. In other words, it's Jesus alone that has the power over heaven and hell. Now, remember what we've talked about. Hell is not Satan's kingdom. Hell is the prison where Satan will dwell, and Jesus holds the keys. Now, I want you to observe how Jesus commends the believers in Philadelphia. It's found in verse 8. He says this. He says, I know your deeds. I mean, everybody can see with a naked eye, Philadelphia, I know your deeds. Behold, I have put before you an open door which no one can shut. Because you have a little power and have kept my word and have not denied my name. What Jesus is doing is he's admonishing this church that Philadelphia, you're the church, you're the real deal. He's saying, I'm the one who, the holder of the keys, is vouching for you, Philadelphia. Jesus makes a great compliment by what he says next. He says, you, Philadelphia church, you have very little worldly power, but you have been obedient to my word and you're faithful to me. Another way of saying that is the church at Philadelphia was short on power, but they were long on eternal influence. See, worldly power doesn't always equal influence. I remember the story, Chuck Colson. He was a hatchet man for President Nixon. He tells a story of when Mother Teresa came to Washington, D.C. This was back in the 70s. And she came to Washington, D.C. She was invited to come and speak before a joint session of Congress. Here's a woman with no penny to her name. She had no dollars to her name. She comes, she's invited to Washington, D.C. Her plane lands at D.C. airport. She gets off the plane, files out, she doesn't have any luggage. She walks out the front door. She gets in a predetermined vehicle, and that car immediately took her downtown Washington to speak to a soup kitchen and to serve at a soup kitchen in a rough part of D.C. And all the starched politicians who were ready to meet her and interact with her, they jump in their limos and they follow her down to downtown D.C. The one with no money to her name was the one with power. See, influence in God's economy, that's power. Now, Jesus is going to make some promises to these faithful believers in Philadelphia. First promises he makes is in verse 9 and 10. Then he's going to make some promises in verse 12 and 13. Let's first look at the promises Jesus makes to a faithful church in verse 9 and 10. Verse 9, he says, behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan, we'll talk about that here in a second, who say that they are Jews and are not, but they lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet, Philadelphia, and make them know that I have loved you. Then in verse 10, he says, because you have kept my word and my perseverance, I also will keep you from the hour of testing, from an hour of trial. And that hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. So first of all, verse 9, Jesus is pointing out that currently there is a group in this Philadelphia, and Jesus is calling them the synagogue of Satan. Well, that wasn't really their name, but this was a group of people that was harassing Jesus' followers in Philadelphia. And what he's saying is, I will make them, by saying I will make them, I will humble them. And they, as a result, will sit down with you. And they will know that I, Jesus, have loved you. As a result of Philadelphia's faithfulness, those that have opposed the cross, well, they'll be humbled. And they'll eventually become converts. And they'll realize themselves the love of Jesus. Now in verse 10, Jesus promises the believer in the church, because you have been faithful, I will spare you from a tribulation. Now we need to take this as a principle for all churches throughout all time, that Jesus will soften tribulation that the world has to fork out against believers. We're going to address this in future passages, but also as a result of this verse 10, what we know is before Christ's return, those who are faithful to Jesus will somehow be rescued from an even bigger tribulation, that he even describes here, that's a worldwide tribulation. So what he's saying is there's some real perks for following Jesus. He's signaling out, he's saying, Philadelphia, you are going to be blessed as a result of not hiding your faith. You're going to be blessed by being long on influence. Then in verses 12 and 13, he says there's more blessings for the faithful church that's described. Let me look at verse 12 and 13. Again, he's saying, you want to be a faithful church? This is what you have to look forward to. I'm going to bless you. Verse 12, he who overcomes meaning all the stuff that the world throws at you. If you keep chopping wood, well, I'm going to make you a pillar in the temple of my God. And he will not go out from it anymore. And I will write on him, I will write on you, faithful believers, the name of my God. I will write on you the name of the city of my God. And I will write on you that which comes down out of heaven from my God, which is my, Jesus is speaking, which is my new name. Then again, he says in verse 13, he who has an ear, let him hear, and what the Spirit says to the churches. Okay? Verse 12, packed with promises. From Jesus to his faithful church, Jesus says, you will be a pillar in the temple of my God. What does that mean? Well, last week we referenced Psalm chapter 2. Psalm chapter 2 promises that the faithful will one day reign with Jesus. As Jesus sits on his eternal throne, believers will reign with him. This first promise could be an extension of that promise that he gave in Psalm 2. So Jesus says, you're going to be a pillar in my temple. You're going to reign with me. Second, Jesus points out a series of privileges that faithful churches receive that others will not receive. First, what will be written on you will be the name of God himself. Second, what will be written on you will be the name of the new Jerusalem in heaven. And third, what will be written on you is Jesus' new name. So you're going to have these names placed on you. The name of God the Father. Jesus has a new name. That's going to be placed on you. You'll have the name of the new Jerusalem in heaven. What does all this mean? I have no idea. But this is what I know. You're faithful. Jesus blesses the faithful church in the future in ways we cannot even imagine. That's what we know. Now, the application of all of this for the future church today until the Lord returns is found in verse 11. So if you've missed everything else, I don't want you to miss verse 11. Because verse 11 says this. Here's our application today in 2025. Verse 11, he says, I'm coming quickly. This is a repeat. This means when Jesus comes, when he comes, it's going to be very fast. Not going to be time to do a lot of reevaluation. When Jesus comes, it's going to happen fast. The dominoes are going to fall. This is the application, he says to us. Hold fast what you have. Hold fast that no one will take your crown. Jesus reminds the church, when he comes, the dominoes will fall quickly. Do this. Hold fast. You know what he's saying? He's saying, keep doing what you're doing. Don't give up, church. Keep showing up. Keep chopping wood. Don't take time off. Be ready in season and out of season. Don't get sloppy. You remember David's lesson in the times when kings go out to battle. David wasn't where he was supposed to be. What he's saying here is be where you are supposed to be. Don't quit. Don't ever quit. Don't give up. You know, it's the old thing where, you come into some meeting and you're sitting there and he says, look on your right and look on your left. One of you, of the three of you, won't be here in 5 years. That could be pretty true about a church, any church. Because it takes some stick-to-itiveness to keep showing up day after day, year after year. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, sometimes you get weary. As difficulties come. And you're like, man, I've been trying to do this stuff, and it's hard. 5 years, I'm done with that. A pandemic comes, I'm done with that. But he's saying, hold fast. I want to share with you a story that was written in 2003. It was written by a fellow by the name of Rick Riley. He was a sports writer. He writes the following story in 2003. What I have done is I have pared it down. I have done some editing on it to make it appropriate for our time here. So allow me to tell you this story that Rick Riley wrote in 2003 about a young man who was a junior in high school at a high school in Anderson, South Carolina. Ben Coleman holds the record for the slowest cross-country runner in the United States. On a typical 3.1 mile race, which he runs in about 40 plus minutes, the best runners do it in about 20. You see, Ben was born with cerebral palsy. Ben has limited control of his arms and stiffness in his legs. It makes running a strenuous task at best. Why does he do it? Ben loves to run. See, Ben always had a dream. Ben had wanted to be a member of a sports team. That's all he wanted. I just want to be a member of a sports team. And Ben finally got his wish as a junior in high school. Chuck Porter, the T.L. Hanna High School cross-country coach, well, he gave Ben a place on the team. At every race, the gun sounds, and the picture is always the same. The pack pulls farther and farther ahead while Ben falls farther and farther behind. When Ben runs, he falls quite often. Sometimes through the course of the 3.1 mile race, he may fall 3, 4, 5 times. And every time he falls, my heart stops, his mom says. Then it's about a minute process where he gets himself back up, and then he leans forward and begins to go again. Ben says, my goal is to cross the finish line no matter what. You see, Ben inspires, not because he wins. He never wins. Ben inspires because he doesn't quit. He hasn't quit once. Something amazing happens after about 25 minutes. Everyone else has finished the race. And get this, everyone comes back to run with Ben. Ben's teammates, the other team's runners, cheerleaders, everyone. And so when Ben finally finishes at about 42 to 45 minutes, 100 people are usually running with him, cheering him on. When Ben finishes, from the roar of the crowd, you'd have thought he just won the Boston Marathon. Why do they come back to run with Ben? Because Ben Coleman never quits. His mom continues to describe the picture. She says, words can't describe the moment. I see grown men standing at the finish line and they cry. When asked why he doesn't quit, Ben says this. He says, it's just more fun to keep going. When you became a Christ follower, whether you realized it or not, you entered a race. And once you entered this race, you had an enemy who was working overtime to get you to quit. That was his sole agenda. And this enemy causes you to stumble. And when you stumble, and you will stumble, and we do stumble, there's an interesting picture from the heavenlies. When we stumble, God is our biggest cheerleader to root us on, to get up and keep going. But it's hard to get up and to keep going. It's hard to maintain. But what you find is if you keep going, Jesus and a great cloud of witnesses surround us, and they run with us. And one day, this picture that he gave the church at Philadelphia, one day when we finish our course, we will hear a roar from heaven that will make all the previous obstacles seem trivial. Plus, I think what you'll find, it's more fun to keep going. So keep going. Don't stop. Be where you're supposed to be, because the minute you quit is too soon. At this time, I want to ask my ushers if they would come forward and pick up the offering. Let me pray for you as they come forward. As soon as you come forward, you go ahead and start passing the plates. Lord God, our culture has made it so easy for us to bail. Our culture has made it so easy to give up. But Lord, I pray for every man, woman, and child in this room that we would never stop. We would never give up. We would keep going. Because the minute we quit is too soon. Go ahead.